In a green valley between two mountain slopes lay a little village crowned by the castle of Oppenheim that stood on a mountainside built on projecting slabs of rock. The quaint old houses of the village, with their red, slanting roofs and black-beamed walls, made a pretty picture in the May sunshine as Count Karl of Oppenheim rode through the stone-paved highway, mounted on his white steed, decked with scarlet fringes. The lilac bushes were in flower. The air was sweet with their scent. The laburnums hung out for gold rain between the houses. The cherry trees in the little gardens shed their blossoms like snow. At the farther end of the village was a house somewhat larger than the peasants' cottages, with many gables and corners. This house was surrounded on all sides by a thick briar hedge. The Count knew that it belonged to an old woman who was said to be a witch. There she had lived all alone, save for her 7 cats, her 7 ravens, her poultry, famous for the remarkable size of the eggs, and her little granddaughter, Babette. Count Karl had heard that the old woman was dead. There had been a great fuss about her burial. The villagers had said that as she was a notorious witch, she ought not to be buried in consecrated ground. But as the old lady had left money to the church, her tombstone was erected after all in the little churchyard. The village boys declared that they had seen her riding on a broomstick over the church spire, but the Count did not believe such tales. He wondered what would become of the child. She was the prettiest as well as the most mischievous and ill-behaved child in the village. As the Count came up to the house, he heard voices shouting and scolding. Then he saw a strange hunting scene. The hunters were not men, but women with sticks and brooms, and the creature pursued was neither a hare nor a fox, but just a little girl. Yes, it was little Babette, the witch's granddaughter. She was leading the fat peasant women a fine dance. They were quite unused to running, and were obliged to stop every few minutes to pant. Then Babette danced just before them, made naughty faces, and, oh fie, stuck out her little red tongue. Her hair blew over her head in a fresh breeze, till she looked like some tall flower with curling petals. Sometimes she stopped and shook her little fist at her pursuers. Then off she flew again. She knew every nook and corner of a garden, and that was to her advantage. The Count paused, laughed, then blew a blast from his horn. Instantly, everyone stood still, as if they were living pictures. "Hi, ho, come here, good folk," he cried. The women came at once, wiping their hot faces with a corner of their aprons, puffing and blowing like so many fat seals. Babette stood at a safe distance, but near enough to hear all that went on. "Please, sir," said one of the women with a curtsy, "as your lordship knows, the child's granny is dead and buried. 4 days has the child lived here all alone, never a bite or a sup has she had. She will die of starvation." Here Babette laughed. "She hides in the bushes like the wild cat that she is." "Babette, little Babette, come here, child," he called, interrupting the old woman's narrative. She came at once in obedience to his gentle command. She gave him one glance out of her deep brown eyes, lifting up her long black lashes, and his heart was captured at once. He was very fond of children, but he had none of his own. Here was a beautiful child that seemed ready-made for him. Not one of the women before him really wished to keep her, for they feared her and the supposed power of her dead grandmother. Meanwhile, the child stood by the Count and began to stroke his fine embroidered sleeve. Finally, she slipped her little hand into his. This settled the matter. "Well, well, we must see what is to be done for the child. Meanwhile, I shall take her up with me to the castle. She seems to have made you all rather hot," he remarked mischievously to the reddest and stoutest of the women. "A devil's brat, I call her," she muttered in her turn between clenched teeth. "Hush," said my lord indignantly. "She looks more like a little angel." And indeed, at his kind words, her small face had become very sweet. As he mounted his horse again and lifted Babette to place her before him, she began to cry bitterly. "Why, little one, what ails you?" he said. "Are you frightened?" No, said Babette, but I don't want to go away from my beautiful home. You shall have a far more beautiful home, and everything that you can want shall be yours, he said. Why, you'd have started alone, you poor little thing. Oh no, said Babette. For Lucky, she's my pet hen, you know. Always lay the biggest eggs for me. Then I make a little hole and suck them so. She tossed back her curly head. Then I am never hungry or thirsty. Oh, who will feed Lucky and all the baby chickens and my cats? She continued and began to cry again. We will fetch them all up to the castle, said his lordship consolingly. The road wound upwards and upwards until they reached at length the gateway of the castle. The heavy gates stood open to receive them. There was a pretty terraced garden in the front, where peacocks strutted up and down, who nodded their heads as if they knew Babette. A dog sprang out, barking to meet his master. Count Carl patted his head, then he lifted Babette from his horse and led her by the hand into the castle. Welcome to Eppenheim, my little maid, he said formally but kindly. Her little heart beat fast, for she was timid like all wild, untamed creatures, and did not know what might happen to her next. The Count drew back the heavy curtain that hung before the entrance to a room, and there in a deep window niche sat a lady dressed in a rich green velvet dress with puffed sleeves and a gold chain round her neck. She was working embroidery on a frame. She sprang up at once as her husband, for it was the Countess herself, entered the room and uttered a cry of surprise as she saw a child. Why, what dirty little thing have you picked up? Send her away again at once, she said imperiously. Don't touch me, child, as Babette attempted to stroke her grand dress. No, the Count had not noticed that Babette was very dirty, that her red pinafore hung in rags and her hair had not been combed for many a day. He was somewhat taken aback, and saw that he had been rash. She shall be washed and properly dressed, and then you will see, he said. He dared not tell her his plans at once. He sent for his old nurse, who had brought him up as a boy, and gave the child into her care. The poor woman soon had her hands full, I can tell you. He might as well have tried to dress a hare as Babette. She would not stand still for a second, and as for a bath, she seemed to be quite afraid of it. However, several maids were called, and Babette was bathed in spite of kicks and screams. She was no sooner in the water but she began to splash about like a baby, and to enjoy herself finally. It was almost as difficult to get her out as to put her in. Some old clothes that belonged to a Count's sister were produced. Babette thought them very fine and seemed quite pleased. She stroked the old nurse's cheek, chucked her under the chin, and sprang up and down violently on her knee, nearly cracking my old bones, as nurse related afterwards. Her curls were in most trouble. It would take more than one day's brushing to set them in order. Meanwhile, Count Carl had been explaining to his wife that he meant to adopt Babette and bring her up as his own daughter. A witch's offspring without a family pedigree, exclaimed his wife. Must I be mother to a witch's brat? Just then, the witch's brat entered the room, making a funny, bobbing curtsy, as nurse had taught her to do, just outside the door. Very pretty she looked in her low-necked, white-embroidered frock, with a cherry-colored sash, her face flushed after the bath. Even her ladyship was bound to acknowledge that she was quite a lovely child. What is your name, child? She said condescendingly. I don't love you, said Babette, and stuck out her tongue. Babette, said the Count sternly, if you're a good little girl and do as you are told, you may stay here with us, and this lady will be your mother, and I your father. Then you'll be brought up as a lady, instead of becoming a little heathen and wild girl of the woods. Babette stood still a moment, as if she were considering the matter. Then she gravely kissed his lordship's hand. The Countess extended her lily-white fingers, and Babette kissed them as well, but timidly, for she feared a rebuff. Just at this moment, a noise of scratching and mewing was heard at the window. Babette flew to open it, and in walked, what do you think, 7 cats with their tails in the air, rubbing themselves comfortably against the window pane. "Oh, my dear Fachin, dear Silverpaws, how glad I am to see you," explained Babette, and she kissed them all. "What next?" said the poor Countess, holding up her hands in horror. In a few minutes, there came a rap at the window, 7 times repeated. These were the ravens. However, they did not venture into the room. They were afraid of a big gun that stood in the corner. They flew straight up into a tall fir tree, and there they chattered away as usual, hidden by the dark branches. The funniest sight of all was the arrival of the poultry. The cocks walked first with an air of importance and authority. The baby bantams sat on their mothers' backs. The whole procession toiled up the hill to the castle and entered by the yard gate. The servants watched them with astonishment. They too said, "What next?" However, no one grumbled, not even the Countess when she heard of it, for such guests were welcome. The old witch's hens were renowned for the size of their eggs. They had often been bought for use in the castle. Now the clock struck 7. High time for little girls to have their supper and go to bed, said her ladyship. And nurse was called and carried Babette off again. A beautiful wooden cot, painted white and gold, stood in the room where Babette was to sleep. It was still called the nursery, for the Count and his sister had slept there as children. Nurse persuaded her to let 5 of the cats sleep outside in the barn, but she begged so hard to have Fachin and Silverpaws that nurse sent for a bundle of hay, and the 2 pussies slept in the corner of the room to keep her from feeling homesick. Babette stole out of her bed at 6 o'clock the next morning. She dressed herself in haste. She was so anxious to see her new surroundings. It seemed to her like a wonderful dream, or like one of the fairy stories that her old grandmother had so often narrated to her. Yesterday, little wild Babette, whom no one cared for and everyone scorned. Today, the Count's own daughter. She would try and be so good, never naughty anymore. She smoothed her hair a little with her fingers. Washing she did not think necessary. Then she went down the big oak staircase, followed by her 2 pussies. When the young servants saw her, they began to tease her unmercifully and to pull the cats' tails. Then Babette grew very angry. "Leave my cats alone, will you?" she said. She stamped her little foot, made ugly faces, and used bad words. Finally, she escaped from her persecutors into the garden. Here she was alone. She sat down and cried with rage and sorrow. She had meant to be so good, but it was very hard when people were so horrid. However, she heard a cock-a-doodle-doo from the henhouse, and ran off there, forgetting her troubles. She was greeted by a chorus of melodious voices. They made such a noise that they woke my lady out of her comfortable early morning doze. Lucky had laid an immense egg. She rolled it with pride to the feet of her young mistress, who promptly began to suck its contents. The ravens flew down to greet her, and she stroked their glossy plumage. The 5 cats were still shut up and mewed bitterly. Babette luckily met one of the gardeners, who opened the doors of the barn and freed the captives. They followed her into the big kitchen with the shining copper pans, purring and rubbing themselves against her legs. Babette coaxed the cook till he gave her 7 saucers of milk. Then there was a great smacking of lips. When nurse awoke as usual at 7 o'clock, she was frightened to find that her little charge had vanished. "What a child to look after in my old age," she groaned. "And yet she is taking, too. How sweet she looked curled up in the old cot." She soon found out from the servants what Babette has been doing. So the child was seized upon, washed and brushed again, and dressed in a stiff frock with white frills. Quite sober and respectable, our little wild girl looked when she went downstairs for her breakfast to see my lord and lady in the dining room. She sat on the high, straight-backed sofa and played with a carved lion's heads, and had never a word to say for herself until the Count produced a doll that he had rummaged out from among some old treasures. It was yellow from age, but its frock was of satin, and it had on little golden shoes. To Babette, who had never had a doll of her own, it seemed very lovely indeed. "Is it really for me?" she asked in tones of ecstasy. She was perfectly good all of the morning, playing with it, washing its face, dressing and undressing it, and putting it to bed as little girls love to do. At dinner, she shocked the polite company by putting her food into her mouth with her fingers. Forks and spoons she did not know how to manage. So she was sent to have dinner with the servants, who made fine fun of her again, till she flew into a passion and declared with many tears that she would run away. Then they were frightened lest my lord should hear the noise, and soothed and petted her till she was quiet again. They did not mean to be unkind, they were only stupid, and thought her tempers amusing. Well, the days went on, and Babette became more gentle and docile, and gave up many of her wild ways. She saw but little of the Countess, but she grew to admire the grave, silent lady, and to long for some response to her affection. My lord was Babette's best friend and protector in all her childish troubles. Everyone said that he was quite infatuated with the child. He would play ball with her in the garden, regardless of his knightly dignity, as his wife remarked. Babette knew all of the animals about the castle, and ruled over them like a little queen. She would go up to the proud peacocks and say imperiously, "Spread out your tails, or I will smack your silly hens," and they obeyed her meekly at once. She had a pet frog in the pond, and once, when the gardener was scolding her for breaking some of his beautiful lilies, she popped it down his neck, to his horror and disgust. The garden at the back of the castle led into the dense forest by which the mountains were covered. Babette would sit on the stone wall and gaze into the deep shades, as if she could see things there that were invisible to others. She knew how to call the deer. One day she enticed a fine stag into the garden. She made a garland of cornflowers and ox-eye daisies, and threw it over his antlers. Then she sprang on his back, holding a red foxglove in her hand for a whip, and galloped round the garden, singing and shouting, look at me, I am the queen of the fairies." The Countess herself owned that she had never seen a prettier sight. But then she sighed deeply, and said to her husband she feared all was not right with the child. The Count shared her fears to some extent, and Nurse had orders never to let her out of her sight. Nurse had several times seen a strange man watching Babette from over the wall as she played alone in the garden. She too felt nervous and anxious about her little charge. Years passed by. Babette grew into a tall and charming maiden. She learned to read and write, and to play on the harp. She could even speak a little French, which was the fashionable language of a count in those days. So that with these accomplishments she was considered a fine lady, far above the village children who had formerly despised her. One fine evening, she was then about 16 years of age. She was walking with her old nurse in the forest, not far from the castle, picking bilberries and singing to herself songs of her own composing. The wood was very still, not a leaf stirred. The setting sun shone out behind a beech tree, making a brilliant star of iridescent colors that dazzled her eyes. She heard a sudden noise as of a cough. The bushes near her rustled. She felt frightened and called out, "Nurse, nurse," in trembling tones. As she spoke, a man sprang out of the wood and seized her by the arm. Nurse began to scream, but the man raised the sticky on his hand, and she stood as if turned to stone. Babette's courage always rose to emergencies. She looked the man over from head to foot. He was dressed in green with a red feather in his cap. His hair was dark and curly. His eyes were large and would have been beautiful, but they had a wild and sinister look that Babette did not like, and squinted slightly. She seemed to remember his face, but where or when she had seen him before she did not know. Her first thought was that he must be a wizard, like one of those her grandmother had told her stories about. "Who are you?" he said, shaking her slightly. "I am Babette, daughter of Count Karl of Eppenheim," said Babette proudly. "A count's daughter. A fine tale. The witch's granddaughter, you mean," he said with emphasis, and Babette shuddered. "Come along with me, child," he continued. "You must follow me now, and serve me well and cook my dinners. I knew your old grandmother, and have often seen you as a child. A little imp you were," he said. "Now it is high time you learned to be useful. They will only turn your head and teach you rubbish up there at the castle. You must come along with me now." Then he turned to the poor nurse and said, "In half an hour you'll be free to return to the castle. Adieu." He fixed his strange eyes on the nurse, who swooned away, and thus she was found exactly half an hour afterwards by the housemaid, who had followed her to see that supper was ready. You may imagine the consternation at the castle. The poor countess, who had been so cold to Babette, seemed to feel it most. She sat and cried, "Oh, Babette, come back, my dear, and I will be a real mother to you, indeed I will." The count immediately took steps to recover her. The forest was searched through and through by his men, but not the slightest trace could they discover. The 7 ravens said, "Caw, caw," and set off at once in search of her. The next day, Fauchen, Silverpaws, and the other cats disappeared. Lucky and several of the old witch's hens were also missed. It was evident that they'd all followed Babette, and that she must be alive somewhere. But where? That was a question. Wherever is magic at work, it is always a difficult matter. One clever youth remarked that if one could find her pets, why, then one might find Babette. But this brilliant idea was not much of use, as they were all lost. Meanwhile, Babette followed her strange guide with many misgivings and sad sinkings of the heart. They had not gone far when they came to a cottage in the forest, surrounded, like her granny's garden, by a briar hedge. Now I must tell you that Babette had fallen to the power of a reputed wizard. He had the power of making everything within this briar hedge invisible and intangible to those outside, so that poor Babette would be more safely imprisoned there than in an iron-barred fortress. She did not realize this at first. She grew to understand later, when she became more acquainted with a wizard, or Mr. Squint-Eyes as Babette called him, and his ways. The hedge was so thick and high, and the thorns were so huge, it would have been impossible for Babette to think of squeezing herself through it and running away. The wizard parted this hedge with his wand. It closed up thick and close behind him as they entered. The cottage garden was laid out in patches of vegetables. Not a flower was to be seen in it, but there were fruit trees with ripe apples, and pears, plums, and medlars. For it was the early autumn. They entered into the little parlor, which seemed dark and gloomy to Babette. Mr. Squint-Eyes tossed off a mug of beer that stood on the table, and told her to be off to bed. The poor girl was hungry, for bilberries are not very satisfying, and it was supper time. But she crept up the narrow stairs, too much frightened to say a word. She found a tiny room with a white bed in it, a looking-glass, very dim and old and uncanny-looking, with candlesticks on either side, also a primitive washing stand. As she began to undress, a sense of fear and loneliness came over her. She thought of her happy home at Eppenheim, and of the Count, and hot tears began to fall. However, she was accustomed to look at the cheerful side of things. "They are sure to find me tomorrow," she said to herself. She knew she could not be far away. The next morning, she was awakened by a loud knocking at the door. The horrid man who had stolen her poked his head in. Get up, you lazy bones, and see about my breakfast," he said. Babette hurried downstairs and found a small kitchen, with a door leading into the garden. There was a heap of dried wood just outside the door, and after making many attempts, she succeeded in making a fire. She filled a heavy iron kettle from a pump in the yard, making her pretty frock quite black. "That's right, that's the way that women should work," said the wizard coolly. Babette felt indignant and thought that he might offer to help her, but not a bit of it. There he stood, leaning against the door, smoking his long pipe, the picture of laziness. "Please, where's the coffee?" said Babette. "Use your eyes and you will find it," said her polite host. Then she saw a jar on a shelf labeled coffee, and near it the coffee mill. Babette ground the beans till she was red in the face. Then she waited for water to boil. Whilst she was attending to the coffee, rolls and butter appeared on the table, and a blue and white china coffee service. The table seemed to have laid itself, for Babette was sure the man had never moved from the door. Now breakfast was ready. They sat down together, the wizard saying never a word, but lifting one eyebrow at times in a peculiar way that made Babette feel very uncomfortable. After breakfast, he went out of the house, saying, "Clean the house, make the beds, cook the dinner." "But there is no dinner to cook," said poor Babette. "Find it," was all the reply she could get out of him. Now Babette had not been remarkable for obedience and docility, and if anyone had spoken to her like that at home, she would have rebelled at once. But she felt instinctively that her safety here lay in doing exactly as she was told. The man was half mad, she feared, and if she aroused his wrath, he might do her bodily harm. The tears came into her eyes. She felt quite in despair, but she was a brave girl and determined to make the best of things. The vegetables in the garden occurred to her. She would cook some carrots. That was easy. Stewed plums would do for pudding. But what about the soup and the joint? At this point of her deliberations, a hair was thrown over the hinge. This settled the question. Evidently, the man did not wish to starve. But how shall I get its fur off? Thought Babette. Bah, I shall never be able to skin the creature. Just then, she heard to her joy a caw-caw 7 times repeated, and there she saw her dear ravens sitting on a tree just outside the garden. Now, the limit of invisibility did not exist for a witch's favorites. They flew at once to Babette. She told them her troubles and showed them the hair. "That is an easy matter," said the ravens. "The hare has 7 skins. We are 7 ravens. Each of us will take off 1 skin, and then we have the pickings," said the greedy fellows. "Anything, anything you like. Please take it away and bring it back again, all ready to pop in the pot," said Babette. "Potted or jugged hare famous," said the ravens, and they laughed hoarsely. Be quiet, or the wizard will catch you," she said in a warning tone. Now, the dinner was all ready on the stove. Potatoes she had dug out of a garden. Hare and carrots and stewed plums. What can anyone want more, she thought, and felt very proud. But suddenly soup occurred to her. How could she make soup? She had heard that soup was made of bones and water, but she had no bones, and those nice little halfpenny packets for making soup out of nothing were not invented in those days. She put on some hot water with a few carrots and a little chopped parsley in it, and plenty of pepper and salt. She tasted it as a good cook should, and said to herself, "Not bad, I have tasted worse." She laid the table, and punctually at 1 o'clock the man came in. Babette trembled. He proceeded at once to business. He sat down to dinner. Soup came first, which was unfortunate. "Bah," he said, making a horribly wry face. "What stuff, child? Do you wish to make me sick?" "No," said poor Babette. "Never make such soup again, or I shall fetch my sister, and she will cook you," he said with a terrible look. However, the hare was tender, and when a pot of red currant jelly produced itself, seemingly from nowhere, it was quite a fine dinner. The carrots were hard and not scraped, as the wizard said severely. Plums, too much sugar. But in spite of all this grumbling, she felt immensely proud of her morning's work. The house was not cleaned, even were the beds made, but this he did not seem to notice. He lay in the sofa by the window, covered himself up with a bearskin, and snored loudly with his mouth open. Babette made up a fire and put the kettle on to boil for tea. Then she strolled out into the garden. She climbed up into a pear tree. From her perch in its branches, she could see far into the woods. She wondered when her friends would come and rescue her. Then she saw to her delight Lucky and some of her favorite cocks and hens wandering about in search of her. They came scuttling up at once. She held up one finger to enjoin silence. She feared that her capturer might take a fancy for roast fowl if he should see them, so they hid under the hinge. "Now I can make scrambled eggs for supper," thought Babette joyfully. Fauchen Silverpaws had likewise no rest when her mistress was gone, and they too set out in search of her. When they reached a briar hedge, Babette was indoors making tea. They began to mew and made a great noise. "The old woman's cats, by 4," said the wizard. "They know a thing or two. I'll go and let them in." So saying, he again parted the hedge of his wand and let them through. Although Babette was very pleased to see them, she felt a little anxious for welfare. However, the wizard scratched their heads and was quite affectionate to them. He had, it seemed, a partiality for cats. Babette felt a little happier now that her pets were with her, yet her heart was sore. She thought of her lovely house, of her kind, good foster father, and of all her friends, and the tears stood in her eyes. Several weeks passed away, and Babette cooked and scrubbed every day in fear and trembling, like a regular little Cinderella. Being German, she was used to helping in the household. It was not so inexperienced as many English girls would have been, but never a word of praise did she get from her queer companion. But if anything were amiss, when he opened his mouth and scolded the poor girl roughly. A young man was returning home after a day's hunting. He was the son of a knight of a neighboring castle, and his name was Sir Rudolph of Rupertsheim. It was a hot afternoon. The sunlight made a checkered pattern through the forest trees. His bag was heavy with game, and he whistled merrily as he strode between the oak trees and bracken fern. He had a light heart and an easy conscience, few enemies and many friends, and added to these advantages was the exhilarating feeling of youth and perfect health. Suddenly he stopped and looked around him, startled. He heard a sweet voice singing. The notes were clear and distinct as those of a bird, and yet it was no bird. Who could it be in this lonely spot? He could distinguish the words of a song as he held his breath to listen. "A lonely maiden I, sit here and sob and sigh. No man my face can see. Ah, who will rescue me? Oh, lack-a-daisy me. Oh, wasted life of mine, here must I sadly pine. My young life hid must be from all humanity. Oh, lack-a-daisy me. Oh, were a knight so bold, as in the time of old, in days of chivalry, he would deliver me. Oh, lack-a-daisy me." Rudolph's eyes were trained by hunting. He searched the woods carefully round that place, and peered behind every bush and tree, but nothing was to be seen. His heart beat fast. This was a real adventure. Surely, if a wood nymph or fairy were to appear to him here in this lonely forest, it would hardly seem strange. So he summoned up his courage and addressed the wood spirit as he thought. "Who are you? Where are you?" he said. "Be you wood sprite or fairy, I fear you not. I am ready to do your bidding, for your sweet voice and your distress have touched my heart. Appear, oh appear." Babette, for of course it was she, trembled with excitement. This was really a chance of escape. She had seen the young huntsman from her perch in the pear tree, and had made up the impromptu song. She thought it was even more original than her cooking. Now she answered eagerly. "Alas, it is impossible for me to appear unto you, for I am as invisible as if I had on Siegfried's cap of darkness. I was stolen by a horrid wizard when I was walking in the forest with my nurse. Surely you have heard of me." Now, of course, Sir Rudolph had heard of Babette. The story of whose kidnapping was told all over the country, and became more wonderful with every telling. Some people said that the devil himself had carried her off. This was really unkind, for Babette, though lively, was not a bad girl, as we know. "Are you Babette, the witch's granddaughter?" said the young man hesitatingly. "Oh, don't say that. I want to forget that," said Babette, and he heard a slight sob. "I am the adopted daughter of Count Karl of Eppenheim, and oh, a wicked wizard holds me here invisible under a powerful spell." "Just think," said Babette, crying again. "I slave for him all day, and cook, and do all the housework, and yet never a kind word or look do I get from him in return. It is a shame. Oh dear, oh dear. Please don't cry. I really cannot bear it when I can't even see you to comfort you, said Rudolph tenderly. Tell me what to do. Shall I shoot the wizard? No, of course not. Besides, he's invisible too. You might walk through us all and notice no difference. So subtle is the spell, said Babette. Rudolph was one of those specially gifted mortals in whom the sense of things unseen is as clearly developed as the senses of sight and hearing. He never doubted Babette's reality, though I think a more up-to-date youth would certainly have done so, and have thought that his imagination was playing tricks on him. He felt much distressed and perplexed, but could think of no way out of his strange dilemma. But an inspiration came to Babette. Go to Mother Holly, she said, if you really wish to help me. She was an intimate friend of my grandmother's, and she is a powerful fairy, and can perhaps help us. What is your name, brave youth? Sir Rudolph of Ruperstein, he answered. Why then, I know your mother quite well, but you were away traveling with your father when I visited your castle. But quick, we must not delay matters by conversation, though it is dreadfully nice to talk to a real human being again. Her voice sounded near and yet far away. A curious kind of conversation, Rudolph thought it was. Where can I find Mother Holly? Said Rudolph. And will she not drop pitch on my head? I should be no good at shaking featherbeds, you see. Nonsense, she won't expect you to do anything of the sort. She is very kind and friendly. She lives on the Rossert Mountain, quite near to your castle. Hush, hush, go now. My tyrant is waking up, if you're to expect us. Go, go. A complete and somewhat unnatural silence followed, like one of those awkward pauses in conversation when we entertain stiff callers for the first time. Then, Rudolph took the precaution of marking the position of the trees in that part of the wood. 3 tall fir trees raised their heads among the beech and oaks. He cut across thus on each one of them, because trees are so deceptive. This mark is the old symbol of the Mithras cult, 2 axes placed sideways, signifying the striking of fire. It is an old sign, known and respected by the fairies, so he hoped the good folk would see it and further his quest. On one of the firs, the ravens were assembled. They caw-cawed 7 times to indicate their willingness to lend Rudolph their aid. The wizard looked at Babette closely that evening. The newborn hope, perhaps, too. The sight of a handsome stranger had given an extra color to her cheeks. I may have trouble with her yet, he said to himself, and cleared his throat with a rumbling sound. I must tell you that the cocks and hens had betrayed themselves. They were silent all throughout the night, but when the dawn broke, they could not resist one cock-a-doodle-doo. Then the wizard chuckled and brought them in, but nothing had happened to them as yet. Babette lived during the next days in a state of suppressed excitement. She felt that something must happen for good or evil, but she did not know what. Patient waiting, a hard lesson for all of us to learn, but harder still for a maiden of 17 years who had been kept so long in that dull hole. She had passed her birthday in that horrid place. Just think of it, and not one birthday present did she get. She made up for it afterwards by having 2 birthdays at once, but it was not quite so nice. Meanwhile, Sir Rudolph had turned homewards, pondering on a strange adventure, and fully determined to seek Mother Holly's aid. Should he go first to the castle of Oppenheim, and tell Babette's foster parents that he had found out where she was imprisoned? He felt that, credulous though they were in those days, they would only laugh at him, and consider the story as outside the range of possibility. They might even suggest that a cask of Rhine wine had clouded his intelligence. No, he would go home to Ruperstein Castle, and have supper and think it over. So he returned home, and was so silent and dreamy, and his appetite, which was usually of heroic proportions, was so small that his mother felt quite anxious about him. "You are not bewitched, Rudy dear?" she asked anxiously, just as we might inquire if he were a little upset. "I am not sure, mother. Maybe I am," he answered to the good lady's dismay. After sprinkling him with various herbs, she insisted on his drinking some nasty aromatic tea when he went to bed. As she had put some spider's legs in it, and a few choice things of that sort, Rudolph asked to be allowed to take it upstairs with him. But I regret to say he deceived the good lady by pouring it out of a window. I rather think that you or I might have done the same thing under the circumstances, though it was undoubtedly wrong. The full moon was shining into a little window in the gable of the turret. He shook off a very natural sleepiness and fatigue consequent on his night's hunting, took off his soiled clothes, and dressed himself in his fine velvet court suit with a beautiful lace on the collar. He opened the little window, squeezed himself. It was lucky that he was slight for a German knight, through the iron bars, and climbed onto the roof with some difficulty, not to say danger. Then he crawled noiselessly along the castle walls, fearing to be challenged by the warder of the castle on his nightly rounds. But the warder was just enjoying his 7th glass of lager beer, and was not very keen on the lookout. As he dropped outside the walls, his favorite dog began to bark and beg to go with him, but Rudolph did not dare to let him out for fear of creating a disturbance. He soon gained the little path which led through Oppenheim, and then through fields to the woods that clothed the Rossert. Great clouds had obscured the moon, but he was not afraid. He was so used to the woods and could distinguish one creature from another simply by its movements. In his hand he carried a dark lantern. A rough path, covered with rocks and stones, led to the summit of a mountain. As he walked cautiously along, a bat hit him in the face as it blundered along. "Hi-ho, steady there, old fellow," said Rudolph. He now entered the part of the woods where the beeches and oaks grow so closely together that at midday the sky seems green rather than blue. The moon shone out suddenly, and he saw by its light a gruesome-looking head without a body that seemed to grin at him from among the undergrowth. His heart stood still for a moment, and then he laughed at his fears, for he saw there was only a grotesque old tree stump, such as one so often sees in the woods. Suddenly he saw a bright light through the trees, as if one of the bushes were on fire, or was it merely the brilliant moonbeams shining on a wet clearing? For a moment all was still. Then lightning played across his path, revealing a huge, clumsy-looking giant who stood with club uplifted in the way, looking as if he would dash his brains out. Brave though Rudolph was, he did not wish to court danger, so he turned aside into the woods, hoping to find another path before long that was not thus barricaded. Then voices seemed to mock him and to laugh at him, and he had the unpleasant sensation of dark shadows, moving as he moved, shadows unaccompanied by substance. The rain came down, pouring, drenching rain, such as the forests love. In a few minutes he was wet to the skin, as wet as if he had plunged into the river with his clothes on. Naturally, his vanity was to blame for this. In his stout hunting clothes and thick leather boots, even the deluge could not have wetted him through. To add to this, the air was close and stifling, and he had lost his way. All this for the sake of an unseen maiden. What if she were as old and ugly as Fräulein Kunigund, of whom Heinrich von Kleist has written? Somehow he felt that was impossible, but even if it had been so, his natural gallantry would not have deserted him. We will hope that he would have still sought to deliver her. A Christian knight is ready to help all women, be they young or old, rich or poor, plain or pretty. The rain had ceased, but there was a sense of something oppressive in the atmosphere. An owl with eyes that looked like live coals glared at him from a branch of an oak tree, vanishing as he approached. A fox? No, it was too large for a fox. It was a wolf. There were really wolves in the Taunus woods in those days. Came up to him, snarling. Rudolph had his gun ready. The creature moved away into the darkest dreams, snarling and growling as it went. Altogether, I cannot say it was a pleasant walk. I do not think any one of us would have enjoyed it all alone at the dead of night, do you? At this moment came a flash of lightning that struck down a tree just before Rudolph's eyes. He crossed himself involuntarily and muttered a paternoster. A lull followed the storm. The heavens were clear again. Rudolph made out by the light of his lantern a triangular spot made by free footpaths crossing. It was bare of all vegetation. Black ashes were heaped up in the middle, as if gypsies had lately lit a fire there. An irresistible impulse made him enter this triangle, for he felt as if long ghostly arms were trying to hold him back. No sooner had he stepped onto the spot than he fell into a deep sleep or faint. When he awoke, he saw a wonderful light near him. In the midst of a light which seemed to radiate from her presence was a beautiful lady with long, rippling fair hair. "You are safe now in my kingdom," she said. "You have passed the boundary between the good and evil powers, and have left the dangers of the night behind you." "Oh, can you tell me where to find Mother Holly, beautiful fairy?" he said. "Easily enough, for I am Mother Holly," she answered. "I know why you have come here, and I am ready to help you." She took him by the hand, and he leapt to his feet, making a low bow to the lovely lady. All the evil dreams that perplexed him fled as the night before the day, and he could have shouted hurrah for joy and gladness. He had the unshaken confidence in the final victory of good over evil that is so necessary to help us to any measure of success in this world with its checkered lights. He walked with Mother Holly a little way, till they came to an arbor made of honeysuckle and wild roses, surrounded by banks of evening primroses, round which luminous moths were fluttering. Into this they entered, and she sat down and gazed at him till he was quite overwhelmed with her beauty. He had expected to see an old witch hobbling along with a stick and to have feather beds to make. Feather pillows indeed there were in the arbor, very cozy and soft. It was delightful to have a chat with such a woman in such a place, even if there were no Babette in the world. Mother Holly began to speak. Her voice sounded like the murmur of the fir trees. "I have heard that pretty little Babette has fallen to the power of a bad man. He stole the magic book from her grandmother's house, at a time when the old lady was ill and feeble, shortly before her death. He has been only able to make out a few of the spells, that, for instance, for rendering things invisible. He is not a real wizard, so that if you obtain the book, the power will be yours. But I strongly advise you to have nothing to do with magic. It is very dangerous. But to return the book to me, to whom in fact it rightfully belongs." "Have no fear of that," laughed Rudolph. "I don't want it. I would not touch it with the tongs if I could help it. Now listen carefully to my instructions. At the foot of one of the fir trees grows a red toadstool, spotted with white. On it sits an ugly old toad. Take this handkerchief, wrap the toad in it, and cast it to the ground. Pull up the toadstool. Then the whole place will become visible. You'll be able to consult with Babette as to how to overcome old Squint Eyes, as she calls him. Hold this candle light in your hand." She gave him the young pointed top of a fir tree. "It will keep off evil spells. When you have overcome the man, bind him with this grass." So saying, she gave him a bundle of silvery woodland grass. "Then tie him up to the tallest of the 3 fir trees and leave him to us. We will punish him according to his deserts and teach him to behave better in the future. Can you tell me anything about the fair young lady herself? Is she really the granddaughter of a witch?" "I could well believe it, for verily she has bewitched me. But who are her parents? I wish to know for her own sake," asked Rudolph anxiously. "The old woman was really her nurse," said Mother Holly. "It is true that the woman had fairy blood in her veins and was learned in magic, but she never used her powers for any evil purposes, and as for riding on a broomstick, she abhorred such practices. Babette is the granddaughter of a great baron of Siebenbergen. The baron brought his children up strictly as became their rank, but his youngest son ran away from home, and married a village maiden much beneath him in rank. His father was exceedingly angry and refused to acknowledge her. The young wife died when Babette was born. The father went off in despair to the wars. He entrusted the tiny baby to the care of an old woman who had formerly been his own nurse. This old woman, who was spoken of later as Babette's grandmother, had been nurse to the children in Siebenbrücken Castle for many years, but she had been dismissed suddenly in her old age because evil tongues had denounced her as a witch. The Baron did not believe in the charge, but nevertheless he was obliged to send her away. He had his own reputation in the country to think of, and the charge of witchcraft was no light one in those days, and not so easy to disprove. He gave her a handsome pension and a comfortable house, and troubled himself no more about her. Babette's father lost interest in life on the death of his dearly beloved peasant wife. He fought recklessly in the front of battle, and fell covered with many wounds. His body was brought home for burial, and there was a grand funeral in Siebenbrücken. Everyone praised his heroism and lamented his early death, but no one inquired after his peasant wife, or knew the existence of his baby daughter. The notice of the marriage and the certificate of Babette's birth are to be found in the church of Oppenheim, all duly registered and complete. The old nurse became very feeble, and was hardly fitted to bring up such a wild, high-spirited child as Babette. That is all I can tell you. You must find the papers and test the accuracy of the story for yourself. Rudolph was deeply interested. His heart beat fast. Babette became more and more interesting, wrapped round in a web of romance. He wanted to ask more questions of Mother Holly, but she faded slowly away. As she vanished, a voice said, "Adieu. Follow the light path, and nothing can molest you." A long stream of light shone out from where she had stood, and illumined the way through the woods. It shone on and on in one great bright path, like the moon shining over the sea. Rudolph reached home walking like one in a dream, his head full of strange and marvelous fancies. Rudolph awoke rather later than usual, for he was so thoroughly tired out. His mother did not feel so concerned about him when she saw the amount of breakfast he consumed, but he was still silent and abstracted. His adventures seemed to him like a wild dream. It seemed almost absurd to seek for the free furs, but an irresistible longing held him thither. On the stroke of 12 at midday, he stood beneath them, and recognized his own sign, and, oh joy, saw the toadstool with a toad sitting on it. Without a moment's hesitation, he took the handkerchief, which was in itself a proof of the reality of the story, he said to himself, and seized the horrid shiny toad. How it wriggled and squirmed like some evil thing, and cast it to the ground, where it sprang into 1,000 pieces. These pieces took root in the earth, so to speak, and came up again as a multitude of toadstools, quite wonderful to behold. Perhaps you may see them if you ever come across this spot in your excursions to the Taunus Mountains. Then Rudolph took hold of a red and white toadstool on which the toad had sat. Surely, never before had a fungus been so firmly planted in the earth. The whole ground seemed to shake and tremble as he tugged at it. Trees were uprooted in the forest. The earth moved up and down like the waves of a sea. At last it was out, and bumped down fell Rudolph. One of the great fir trees fell as well, luckily in another direction, where he might have been crushed beneath it. When he got up again, he saw to his joy a little red-hoofed house, and a pretty maiden sitting in a pear tree. Babette had been watching him all the time, but she could not make out what he was doing. She had nearly fallen off a tree as he pulled up the toadstool. Now she climbed carefully down and came to the hedge, and their eyes met. Need I say that they fell in love? Or at any rate, Rudolph did at first sight. The hedge parted to let him through. Perhaps it was caused by a fairy's candle, Or perhaps it was Mother Holly's doing. Who knows? Hush, he is asleep. You have come just at the right moment, said Babette. We must secure the magic book, first of all, said Rudolph, holding the fir branch firmly in his hand. And would you kindly light this candle for me? Babette laughed. A funny candle, she said. A fairy candle, he whispered, to keep off evil spells. Mother Holly recommended it. Babette felt inclined to dance for joy. Can you really see me? She whispered. Oh, how untidy and ragged I am. You must think me a perfect fright. I think you're the most beautiful lady I've ever seen, said Rudolph sincerely. And Babette blushed at the compliment and felt very grown-up and important. I will light the candle for you at the kitchen fire. Come, we will go together softly and try to get the magic book. I know where it is. It is under the sofa where old Squint Eyes is asleep. Follow me. Throw all that grass away, she said in her old imperious way. Let me give it to you to hold, said Rudolph. It is also a gift from Mother Holly and may come in useful. They walked together towards the house, Babette holding a bunch of silvery grass, and entered the kitchen. Here, Babette lit the fir branch. It smells just like Christmas. There must be good times coming for poor little me, she said. Then they peeped into the parlor, and there was Mr. Wizard, fast asleep in spite of the earthquake. Rudolph could hardly help laughing. He looked such a funny sight, with his mouth wide open, his nose very red, and his hair hanging over his face. Babette lifted up the bearskin rug and pulled out the heavy book. But as soon as she touched the book, the wizard awoke and seized her by the arm, and sprang to his feet with many curses. When he saw Rudolph, he let go of Babette's arm and tried to seize the young man. Rudolph was fully prepared and threw him off with all of his force. A wrestling match began, and might have ended badly for Rudolph, for his adversary was tremendously strong and agile. But he had unexpected assistance. The ravens flew in at the window and beat themselves against Rudolph's opponent, nearly blinding him. The cat stood in the cupboard, with her backs up and hair bristling, ready to spring if necessary. The cocks and hens crowded on the windowsill in warlike attitudes. Meanwhile, the fumes of a fir candle which Babette had lit filled the room, and Mr. Squint Eyes could not abide the smell of burning fir. He grew weaker and weaker, and more confused, and at last Rudolph threw him down with such force that he was partially stunned. Rudolph then took the woodland grass from Babette, and as he touched it, it wound itself in his hands into a strong cord. He bound the man up with Babette's assistance, and gagged him with Mother Holly's handkerchief. The two of them then lugged him into the wood, and tied him up to the biggest of the fir trees as Mother Holly had directed. Then they fetched the magic book, and placed it under the uprooted fir tree, which instantly stood up again as if nothing had happened, burying the book beneath its roots. They looked at the man they had tied up, bound like a martyr to a tree. He could not curse and swear as his mouth was stopped up, but he rolled his eyes and squinted so violently that he was horrible to look at. Then Rudolph and Babette ran off together. Breathlessly they ran and ran. Babette was afraid old Squint Eyes might wriggle out after all. He was so thin and wiry, and she had no fancy for serving him anymore. Not until they came to a main road through the woods leading to Oppenheim Castle did they pause to look at one another. Then impetuous Babette, she was half a child still, you must remember, flew at Sir Rudolph and gave him a kiss. She turned red and white when she realized what she had done. I couldn't help it, she said. You are such a dear. I'm so very grateful to you for all you have done for me, an unknown and even unseen maiden. Please, don't apologize, dearest lady, he said. I liked it very much. Won't you give me another? Never, said Babette firmly. Subsequent events, however, caused her to revoke this determination. Rudolph did not answer, but offered her his arm, which she took shyly, glancing at him from time to time out of her deer-like eyes with the long fringed lashes. Ragged and untidy as she was, She looked like a princess, and he in his fine clothes, soiled and torn as they were, looked nevertheless like a real fairy tale prince. He took her straight home to Oppenheim Castle, and you may imagine the excitement there. The Count clasped Babette in his arms and could hardly speak for emotion. Then he turned to Rudolph, saying, "We shall never be able to reward you enough." "I shall only want one reward, and that is the little maiden herself," said Rudolph. The Countess wept and cried over her darling child, and said she would never scold her any more. Nurse said, "Well, Miss Babette, you do look a fine sight to be sure, and to come home such a pretty young man, too. Come upstairs with me, and let me make you clean and tidy." And Miss Babette was only too glad to do. A great company of retainers were sent out by the Count to capture the so-called wizard, but they were unable to find either the fir trees with a mark on them, or the man, or the wood cottage. Neither Babette nor Rudolph set eyes on them since that day. I cannot say if they were altogether sorry. The papers proving Babette's parentage were found to be in order, and her father's name and fortune became hers, so that she was not poor despised Babette any more, the witch's granddaughter, but a maiden of good rank and birth with pin money of her own. A short time afterwards, there was a great wedding in Oppenheim, and two happier mortals never lived than Rudolph and Babette on that day, and let us hope for ever afterwards. The end. A tunnel had been dug through a crag which had hitherto been considered as a serious obstacle in the railway route. The light now shone through at the farther end. There was a shout of joy from a tired workman. The air had been stifling in the tunnel. The work was hard and dangerous. Several men had been killed in detaching portions of rock that had been loosened by dynamite. It was a great relief to have got through. Now the walls would have to be made smooth with cement. Indeed, the men had already begun this work at the other end, and the tunnel tested for greater security. Then, the express train could run through directly, instead of being obliged to shunt backwards and forwards in a way that made it very uncomfortable for people who did not like sitting with their backs to the engine. The young engineer, Karl Hammerstein, who had been supervising the men's work, was glad enough to find himself in the fresh air. His head ached violently. The oppression of the atmosphere had well nigh overpowered him. The mountain was clothed on the side with tall forest trees. The drooping firs offered an inviting shade. It was 7 o'clock in the evening. The men were packing up their tools to go home. They would be obliged to march back through the tunnel, for there was no way around except through the wildest forest with a tangled undergrowth of brambles and ferns. But they had their lamps, and did not mind the tunnel. It was familiar enough to them who had worked in it for months. Meanwhile, Karl, who was dead beat, stretched himself out under the trees, covered himself with his cloak, and fell fast asleep, meaning only to rest a minute or two before he also set off home. It was late when he awoke. The full moon was shining. He felt quite dazed. Where could he be? He had slept in many queer little rooms when he was traveling, but they always had a window and a door. Where was a window? He shivered. It was cold. Then an unreasoning terror took hold of him. He was only half awake as yet. What could that dreadful gap be in the wall of his room, blacker than the darkness? Surely it was a bogey hole leading down to the bottomless pit. The next minute he laughed at his fears, as we usually do when we come safely out of nightmare land and feel the earth or bed beneath us again. He saw that it was the mouth of a tunnel, and glancing up he saw the giant fir tree under which he had been sleeping with outstretched arms above him in the light of the moon. "Well, I never! What a dunderhead I am," he said to himself. "Fancy sleeping like that. Why, such a thing has never happened to me before. I had meant to go to have supper and stay the night at the new hotel in Elm. I've heard the landlord's daughter is an uncommonly pretty girl. Hey-ho, he went on, stretching himself. There's nothing for it but to walk home. I might wait a long time before a motor car came to pick me up here. Then he remembered with a sudden start that there was only one possible way back to Elm, and that was through the tunnel. It was not a very pleasant idea to walk back alone through the dark, oppressive tunnel at midnight. Luckily, he had his lantern with him. How could I have been such an idiot, he muttered to himself again. He found some bread and cheese in his pocket, which he ate with a good appetite. His headache had gone, and he felt much refreshed after his sleep. Then he put on his cloak, lighted the lantern, and set out cheerfully to walk through the tunnel. He had not gone far into the black darkness when he thought he heard voices whispering and talking not far away from him. Then he distinctly felt something or somebody brush past him. "Hello, who's there?" he called out. Complete silence. He was not easily frightened, but his heart began to beat quicker than usual. Well, if it's robbers or tramps, they won't find much to rob on me, he thought, for he had only a few shillings in his pocket for his night's lodging. It was probably a bat that had strayed in at the opening, he decided. Suddenly, he came to a standstill. Right across the way was a mass of freshly fallen earth and rock that quite obstructed his further progress. Well, this is a pretty fix to be in. How aggravating, he said to himself, and leant for a moment against the wall of the tunnel to consider what would be best to do. The wall instantly gave way. He stumbled, bruised his arm against a sharp corner of a rock, and his lantern went out. At the same time, he heard a sound resembling the slamming of a door. "Donnerwetter," he exclaimed, a mild German swear which means literally thunderwetter. Whatever shall I do now? He had a box of matches in his pocket, and soon succeeded in relighting the lantern. There is nothing for it but to go back again to where I started from, and wait for daybreak, he thought. By this time, he had become confused and had lost the sense of direction. But there could be only one way back. So he tramped along a long, winding passage that he took to be the excavated tunnel. How curious. I could have been certain the tunnel was much wider and more direct than this. Can I be still dreaming, he thought. Suddenly, he was startled and astonished to come on a flight of steps leading downwards. There had certainly been no stairs in the tunnel. He saw, too, that the walls were painted in a decorative way, like some of the catacombs in Rome, only these were far more elaborate. I'm in for an adventure. I must be lost in the heart of the mountains, he thought. Perhaps I shall come upon a robber's cave, or gypsies may be hiding in these rocks. It is a good thing that I have this pretty little fellow with me, and he touched a revolver in his breast pocket. He then observed in front of him a faint light, other than that of his lantern, and whistled softly with astonishment, as he saw that the way opened out into a cave or vault. A few steps more, and he found himself in an exquisite, though tiny hall, with an arched ceiling supported by pillars of red granite. The walls and ceiling were beautifully inlaid with mosaic work in gold and colored stones, like the interior of St. Mark's, Venice, and he seemed to be of great antiquity, though of this he could not be certain. The light was so dim, though it might have been the brilliant effect of a hole was lost, and the young engineer thought to himself involuntarily, this ought to be lit up by electric light. It would look quite different then. As he was deliberating how electric light might be laid on, a door in the wall opened, and a number of little dwarf men trooped in. They did not see him at first, for he was standing behind a pillar. They settled themselves down on benches that were arranged in a semicircle, and one of them, with an important air, mounted a raised thigh facing them. He was just beginning to speak with the words, "Gentlemen of the committee," when they caught sight of a stranger standing in the center of the hall, lantern in hand. They gave a cry of alarm, and were just going to scuttle away like frightened rabbits, when Carl called out, Hi-ho there, gentlemen of the committee, good sirs. Don't run away. I won't harm you. Christmas tree. Now, Christmas tree is the most solemn oath among the dwarves. It is equivalent to swearing in the Bible with us. How Carl knew this, he did not know. It came to him on the inspiration of the minute. Perhaps his grandmother had told him stories in his childhood about the dwarfmen in which it occurred. It had an instantaneous effect on the dwarves who stood still at once. But you are one of the bad men who are building the tunnel, they cried out. Aha, we can spoil your little game, my good fellow. We can smash you and your snorting old dragon who's come here to devour us into pieces. We can throw rocks in the line. Aha. We have often watched you, but you were not aware of our presence, said the chairman. We had just called a committee to decide what is to be done about this matter of a tunnel. Now you know it is all nonsense about the dragon, said Carl persuasively, as if you were talking to children. You have heard of trains, haven't you? You are not so behind the times as all that. Some of us have seen the dragon and even ridden in him, said Mr. Chairman. There's a famous story about that, but the majority still look upon the railway with suspicion and even distrust. We only ask to be let alone, and not be interfered with by meddling mortals, he said in a gruff voice. What do we need with you? Our civilization and history are more ancient even than that of India or Egypt, and from us the human race is descended. I tell you what, said Carl. I could put you up to a thing or two for all that. We live in modern Europe, you know, and not in ancient Egypt. Now, for instance, why is this beautiful hall, a perfect work of art in its way, so badly illuminated? Badly illuminated? Why, what do you mean? Cried the little man indignantly. Do you not see our glowworms hanging in festoons on the walls? Oh, I see. Glowworms. In the 20th century, that's rather strong, you know. What you want is electric light. What's that? Said the dwarves curiously. You have only to press a little button on the wall like this. He pressed his thumb on the wall, and the whole place is lit up, almost as if it were day. We don't believe it. We don't believe it, said the little man. But it's true, I assure you. Christmas tree, said Carl. Wouldn't it make our eyes blink? Said one thin little fellow. Carl noticed that the dwarves' eyes were small and their faces pale. Most of them had quite white beards and hair. That comes of living so long underground. It is a loss of pigment, thought Carl. Like a geranium that has been kept in the cellar. Now I could fix it up for you, said the young engineer, always keenly on the lookout for a job. We're going to have it laid on in the tunnel. How much would it cost? Inquired the dwarves. Oh, £1,000 or so, said Carl carelessly. He had heard that dwarves were very rich, and he was a good man of business, and had his eyes open to his interests. That's a great deal of money, said the little man in chorus. Oh, as for that, I'm sure we could come to an agreement, said Carl. By the way, he went on, do you happen to have a telephone here? I should like to phone to a friend of mine and tell him where I am. It would be such a joke. What's a telephone? Asked the dwarves. You don't know what a telephone is? Himmel, you are old-fashioned down here. You are only half-civilized. Half-civilized, repeated the dwarves angrily. Let us repeat our civilization. I'll tell you what a telephone is, said Carl, interrupting this burst of eloquence. It is a little tube connected with a wire. You put one part of it to your ear, and then you put your mouth to the tube and say, number 1280, and then listen, and your friend will speak to you from miles and miles away, and you can answer him. We don't believe it, said the unbelieving dwarves. It's true for all that. Christmas tree, said Carl. I could fix that up for you too, if you have any connection with the outer air. You must have, he continued, sniffing, for the air is nice and fresh here, quite different to that in the tunnel. Have you a ventilating shaft? Oh yes, said the little man. We can show you that. and they led him out of a hall. In the passage outside was a great cleft or crevice in the rocks, such as we call in England a chine. Above it the moon shone full and bright. A waterfall rushed down on one side. He saw ferns and dear little plants leaning over the water, growing between the cracks of the rocks. There were also glowworms, cunningly arranged in groups that looked like fairy stars. On the other side, he observed to his joy rough steps leading upwards cut in the solid rock. He sighed a sigh of relief. Here at least was a way out. He regarded the pretty sight with the eye of a professional engineer, rather than that of the artist. That must be a stiff climb for you little men up there, he said. Now, if you had a lift... What's that? Asked the dwarves eagerly. It's a little room that goes up and down when you pull a wire rope. We don't believe it, said the skeptical gnomes again. It's true, nevertheless. Now wouldn't it be fun to have a ride in it? I could fix that up too, you know, if you gave me time and helped a bit yourselves, said Carl. Really, you poor things, he went on. You do not seem to have heard much of modern technical progress down here in this rabbit burrow. I beg your pardon, I'm sure, as he looked displeased again. And I'm really curious to know, have you heard of Zeppelin? Zeppelin, no. Is he the king of Germany? Said the dwarf who had been in the chair. Haha, king of Germany. Well, he is nearly in some people's eyes, said Carl. He has built an airship. It is the most wonderful of all new inventions. It floats in the air like a boat does in the water. Close by it passes, by soft breezes fanned, like a great steamboat straight from fairyland. He went on in an enthusiastic way. You can go for a ride in it any day in Frankfurt, providing the weather is fine, you can afford to pay 15 euros. Just listen to him, said the dwarves. We don't believe a word you have said. You are imposing on our credulity, you bad man. And thereupon they flew at him and began to beat him with their clubs, which were heavily weighted, and to pinch him with their long fingers. It might have gone hardly with him, but quick as thought Carl flashed out the little revolver from his pocket. They seemed to know the meaning of that modern toy, for they crouched back trembling and not daring to move. Now stop it, will you, he said, or I shall have to shoot you and take you home with me to be stuffed or put in the National Anthropological Museum. They would give me a good price for you, he said musingly. They would think you were the missing link. Oh please, Mr. Hammerstein, don't shoot us. However did the little chaps find out my name, thought Carl. We will believe all you say, even if it seems the greatest nonsense to us. After all, birds fly, bats fly, and fairies fly. Why should not ships and trains fly? Said the spokesman, who I must tell you was a relation of King Reinhold in the Taunus Mountains, and was proud of belonging to a royal family. Carl called him Mr. Query, because he was so fond of asking questions, but so slow to take in a new fact, as indeed were all the dwarves. You promised us Christmas tree not to harm us, said Mr. Query reproachfully. Well, I didn't hurt anyone, did I? But how about your treatment of me? That wasn't in the contract either, said Carl. Meanwhile, Carl looked about him curiously. He had never been to Dwarfland before, and might never have the chance of visiting it again, and he did not wish to lose the opportunity of seeing all he could. Are there any more of you? He asked the dwarves. I should think so, they answered. Hundreds and thousands of us live under this mountain. Carl noticed passages running in all directions, and low caves which seemed to be dwellings, many of them richly ornamented and furnished. In one of these caves he observed a looking-glass, and wondered which of the dwarfmen trimmed his beard before it. He met a great many little men scurrying about, who cast anxious glances at the giant who had stayed among them. Carl had frequently to stoop. The ceiling seemed very low to him, although they were high enough compared to the dwarfmen. Where are the female dwarves? He asked abruptly. Dwarves have no womenfolk, Mr. Query replied. We did away with them long, long ago. That was rather rough on them, eh? Said Carl. Well, it happened so many centuries ago that we have forgotten all about it, and so are unable to gratify your curiosity. Perhaps if you care for antiquities and just study the pictures on the walls, you might find out. Not my line, said Carl shortly. As we have no women, Mr. Query continued, we never quarrel and have no differences of opinion. I expect no lady would care to live down here with you in this dark hole, said Carl thoughtfully. But to whom does a looking-glass belong? A fairy comes to visit us occasionally. She makes herself useful and tidies up the place a bit for us, said the dwarf. She's here now. Would you like to see her? Of course I should, said Carl, his heart beating fast as the thought of meeting a real fairy. Perhaps she was a princess in disguise, and he might be chosen to win her. The dwarf drew back the curtain that hung before a beautifully furnished cave, and there Carl saw a young girl who was busy dusting and arranging handsome gold vases on a carved bracket. Even by the pale light of the glowworms and the lantern which he had not yet extinguished, he could see that she was very beautiful. She had a mass of red-brown hair that waved in tiny curls about her forehead, and hazel eyes with dark eyelashes. As to her figure, she was small and slight, so that she did not look quite so monstrous in that little world as Carl did. She had a big holland apron on, with a gaily embroidered border. When she saw Carl, she laughed. To think of meeting a young man in this old hole! How funny, she exclaimed. Are you a fairy? Said Carl, bewildered by her beauty. Do I look like one? She answered with a toss of her bronze curls. Not exactly, said Carl, but then I've never seen a fairy. You are pretty enough for one. She made a little curtsy in acknowledgement of compliments. I'll have finished my work soon, she said, and then we will go home together. That'll be delightful, said Carl. The dwarves were looking on. You may go, said Mr. Query. You have worked enough for today. He handed her several pieces of gold. Her eyes sparkled with glee as she pocketed the coins. She was proud of having earned some money. Follow me, she said to Carl, and I will show you the way home. You would never be able to find it alone. The dwarves have burrowed here like moles, said Carl aside to the girl, and I believe they're almost as blind and ignorant. Do not speak disrespectfully of moles, said a dwarf who had overheard the last part of his remark. They belong to the most intelligent of all creatures. Who can build a fortress like the mole? Nora, said the dwarves. Nora, when are you coming again? Very soon, she said. I'll bring some metal polish with me and make your vases shine. Nora, thought Carl, so that is her name. I wonder where she lives. Nora led the way back through intricate passages until they came to the open space where there was a staircase leading up to the outside world. Good morning, she said to the dwarves. Carl pulled out his watch. Yes, the night was already past. It was 4 o'clock. I'll drop in again soon and see about your little commissions, he said to the dwarves. Electric light you want, telephone and lift. It'll be rather a big job. And what about the airship? Asked Mr. Query. Oh, I can't rig that up for you. You must go to Frankfurt and see that for yourselves. Good morning, and he turned to follow Nora, who was already some way up the stone staircase. From a distance, she really looked like a fairy. The light of dawn shone on her wonderful hair. She had taken off her apron and had on a white dress trimmed with gold that fluttered as she mounted the steps. At the top, she waited to take breath, and Carl easily caught her up. They gazed down to the depths beneath them, but no trace of dwarfland could they see. Even the glowworms had vanished, and the rough steps looked like natural niches in the rock. They were on the top of a mountain. Nearby stood a grove of firs, with trees so gnarled and stunted from their exposed position that they looked like a dwarf forest, and seemed appropriate growing there. Your name is Nora, said Carl boldly, but that is all I know about you. I am no fairy princess, alas, said Nora, but only a poor landlord's daughter. My father and I have a new hotel in Elm. Oh, you must be the pretty innkeeper daughter then, of whom I have heard so much, said Carl. Now isn't it funny? I had meant to stay the night at your hotel on the chance of seeing you. And now we meet under the earth in Dwarfland, Romantic, I call that. Why do you work for those little beggars? He continued. For the same reason that you have proposed doing so, she answered. To earn money. I was picking bilberries in the mountains and strayed into their land by chance one day. I found them busy at work spring cleaning and helped them a bit, and that was my first introduction to the dwarves. They pay me well for little work, and starting an hotel costs a great deal of money, you must know. I am glad to be able to help my father. You do not come from this part of Germany. You speak quite differently to us, said the young man inquiringly. My home is over the seas, said Nora. My father is an Irishman, but we find it hard to get on there, and meant to emigrate to America. Then father changed his mind, and we came to Germany. My mother died some years ago, she said sadly. Poor child, said Carl in a deep, sympathetic voice. There must be a good deal of responsibility on your young shoulders. I should just think so, said Nora with a sigh. But our hotel is going to be a tremendous success. As she spoke, she led the way through a little, narrow path, across the heath where heather grew, and great masses of yellow, starred ragwort. Ah, me beloved golden flower, she cried, pointing the plant out to Carl, who had passed it by 1,000 times as a common weed, but to whom it seemed from this day forth to be alive and full of meaning. We call it fairy horses in Ireland, she said, with a rapt look on her face. Sure, and I can see my native mountains when I pluck it, and her eyes filled with tears. She wanted no consoling, however. Her mood changed quickly enough. Do come here, she called out to Carl, and see what I found now. She showed him a clump of pure white heather. It is tremendously lucky, she said, and you shall have a bit too. So saying, she stuck a piece of white heather in his buttonhole. Real white heather, not the faded flowers which children sometimes mistake for it. Carl treasured the spray carefully. And how did you come to be among the dwarves? Said Nora. But their further conversation was checked by a little brook that ran straight across the path. Now Nora usually took off her shoes and stockings and waded over the stream, but she did not like to do so with Carl looking on. Carl would have liked to pick her up in his arms and carry her across like a true hero of romance, but he was shy of proposing it. So he fetched some large flat stones, placed them dexterously in the stream, and sprang across himself. Then he held out a hand to Nora, who stepped over as quickly and gracefully as a young deer. Now I will tell you how it was you found me in Dwarfland, said Carl as they walked on together. I was at work on the new tunnel. You'll not be telling me that you are a working man, said Nora. No, I'm an engineer. I was on duty looking after the men. Then somehow or other, I fell against the wall of a tunnel and hurt my arm. He showed her his torn coat as proof of the story. Poor thing, she interrupted. Did you bind it up properly? Oh, it was a mere nothing, said Carl. Well, I found myself in a strange, winding passage that lay right down to the central hall of the dwarves. He did not wish to say that he had been asleep. He thought that would sound so silly. Queer little fellows they are, those dwarves, he continued. Awfully ignorant, too. Now will you believe it is they've never heard of a Zeppelin airship? We'll really have to give them lessons, said Nora, laughing. But perhaps they are not so stupid as to make themselves out to be. Climbing over boulders and stones, laughing and talking a while like two children just out of school, they reached the bottom of the mountain and saw the village. It could hardly be called a town as yet, for Nora's father hoped that the new railway station would speedily convert into one. Do you know where our hotel is? Said Nora. It is at the other end of the village. We will go round through the fields. The village folk stare so. They are up at 5 o'clock to do the field work. There it is, she called out proudly, pointing to a large white house with green shutters on which the words Hotel Fancy were written in large gold letters. What a queer name for a hotel, said Carl. Yes, don't you think it's original and attractive? Said Nora. There are so many hotels called Hohenzollern, or the German Emperor, and so I thought we would have a change. It is a splendid idea, said Carl, who was over head and ears in love with Nora by this time and thought that everything she did and said was perfect. Still, like a prudent German, he wondered to himself if she would make a good housewife, He knew she must be good at cleaning, or the dwarves would hardly have employed her. But her dainty little hands did not look like cooking. What would it matter if the dinner were burnt sometimes, he thought, if I could have such a pretty, fascinating little girl to marry me? Will you come in and have some breakfast? Said Nora, as they approached Hotel Fancy. Rather, he said. I must own that I am famished. I only had a dry bit of bread and cheese for supper, and that was a long while ago. It was early still. Nora's father was not yet up, so she set to work and lit the fire, and soon had the water boiling for coffee. She set a fine breakfast before him, ham and eggs and sausage and rolls. I am bound in strict veracity to say that love did not prevent his consuming a large amount. He changed his mind about her cooking, and thought that she could do everything well and was a model of perfection. Do have some too yourself, he said, and Nora soon joined him with a hearty appetite. Mr. O'Brien, for that was the name of Nora's father, was astonished to find him at breakfast when he entered the comfortably furnished parlor. An early guest, father, said Nora. He is going to put up here for a present. He's an engineer at work in the tunnel. Good thing for us, she whispered the last sentence. I will see about getting your room ready, she said, turning to Carl. Please do not trouble, said he. I am due at the tunnel again at 7 a.m. It is 6 o'clock now. I hope to return tonight about 8 o'clock. Then I shall be glad of a room, he said, with a hardly suppressed yawn. Pray excuse me. I had rather a bad night, he added with a twinkle in his eyes that only Nora perceived. As soon as he was gone, Nora handed some gold pieces to her father. And do you think that I'm doing right in taking this money from you, Nora? He asked. Why, of course, father. I'm telling you that it's fairy gold and will bring us luck, she replied. The Irish have a great respect for luck and omens. Many of them still believe in the good folk, and Mr. O'Brien, who was of a very easygoing disposition, was quite satisfied with this explanation. Some weeks passed. Carl and Nora became better friends every day. All Carl's previous notions of a universe had been knocked on the head by his visit to Dwarfland. He had thought that he knew almost everything that there was to be known, but now he was always on the lookout for surprises. Moreover, his love for Nora had opened his eyes. Every bush seemed to blaze with fire, and the roses and pinks in the gardens smelt as they had never smelt before. Nora was like a fairy princess. She was not easy to win, she loved her freedom, and wished to call no man lord and master. Because she was such a wild bird, and of a poetic and dreamy temperament, Carl's practical mind appealed to her. He possessed that which she and her father lacked. She was tired of her father's promises and castles in the air, which usually ended up in bitter disappointment. How many guests had they had since Hotel Fancy had been opened? She could almost count them on her fingers. The peasants frequented the old inn that they were accustomed to in the village, and very few strangers came their way. I will play waiter on Sunday and help you, said Carl one Saturday evening when he returned from his work. Indeed, and you'll not need to, said Nora with a pretty Irish lilt in her voice. It's not many people will be coming. It'll be different, of course, when the new station is built. Then we shall be flourishing, she continued. It was a fine Sunday afternoon. Carl and Nora sat in the garden under the plane trees, which made a checkered pattern in shadow on the ground, and sipped glasses of apple wine, or cider in German fashion. It was a queer thing that we two should meet in the little people's land. It seems as if we were meant to pull together, doesn't it? Said Carl with an effort. Nora jumped up immediately, saying that she must see if the water was boiling for coffee. No, no, said Carl, catching her by the hand. You're not gonna run away like that. You've just gotta listen to me, Nora, for I can't keep it in any longer. You are my fairy princess. I love you with all my heart, and I want you to promise me to be my little wife. Will you? You don't know me yet, said Nora, blushing like a rose. I've got a most awful temper. I'll risk it, said Carl, laughing. And they played their trough under the trees in the garden, with no one but the empty chairs and tables looking on, that were spread in anticipation of the guests who had not arrived. So Carl and Nora were engaged to be married, and were as happy as ever it is possible to be in this world. They did not celebrate the event in the usual ceremonious German fashion, for Nora's friends and relations were in Ireland, and she had only a few acquaintances in Germany as yet. Karl's mother was a widow, and lived with her married daughter in Pomerania, so she could not come so far south for anything less than a wedding or a funeral. Now Karl began to consider the material side of the question. Will the love that we are rich in light the fire in the kitchen, and the little god of love turn the spittle? What had they to live on? He was a young man, and his income was very small. It takes many years in Germany to make a career as an engineer, unless you're exceptionally lucky and have influential friends. Hotel Fancy was rather like its name, and did not pay at all as yet. Now Karl had not forgotten the dwarves, and Nora began to miss the gold pieces which had disappeared fast enough in the last few weeks. I tell you what, she said. We will go together to Dwarfland. You can arrange about the electric lights, and I will do some metal polishing. We will meet afterwards and come home again together. It'll be splendid fun. How can we get there? Asked Karl somewhat dubiously. Why, the same way as we came out. Through the rocky gap. I know the way as well as anything. I've been there frequently, said Nora. It was early autumn. The evenings had begun to close in. Karl had managed to get off earlier than usual. Still, it was almost dusk as the two set out to go to Dwarfland. The sun was setting, and threw a wonderful golden glow over the world that was reflected in the hearts of the young lovers. My stones must be there still, said Karl as they came to the little brook, for who could have taken them away? Yet to his surprise there were no stones there, neither were any to be found in the neighborhood. There was nothing for it but to carry Nora over. He did not feel so shy and embarrassed this time, as he picked up his little sweetheart, laughing and struggling in his arms. You're as light as a feather, he said as he set her down again. A feather bed, you mean, she said. And they're a pretty fair weight. I shall never get used to German feather beds, she continued. I can't even get them to look right when I make them and shake them. You need to be born and brought up to them to appreciate them, he replied. But never mind. What does it matter? What is a feather bed in comparison to our love? They laughed for pure joy and good humor as they walked along. Ah, how quickly time passes when one is so happy. The sunlight gilded the rocks before them, till they looked as if they contained streaks of gold ore. They crossed the little moor and clambered over the rocks till they reached the stunted fir grove. Looking back, they saw that the sky had become a glowing red, as it often does just before the light dies out. Seen through the dark, twisted trees, the wood appeared to be on fire. The lovers sat down and gazed for a few moments in silence till the glory faded from the sky. Now for it, Nora, said Karl, getting up and offering a hand. The way down to Dwarfland must be quite near here. Of course I know. I can find it at once, she answered. They searched carefully around for a great crack in the rocks, but could find nothing in the least resembling it. How absurd. How can we miss it when it's certainly not more than a yard or two away, said Nora. The steps were not so easily recognizable if I remember rightly, said Karl, but we are sure to find them in a minute. It grew darker and darker. The mountain was covered with boulders of stone, juniper bushes and stunted trees, but no trace of a green rent in the mountainside could they discover. Did we dream it all? Said Karl. Impossible. Why, I have been down there many times, said Nora, beginning to feel bitterly disappointed. Supposing I were to fetch some of my men here and blow up the rocks with dynamite, we might be able to get in them, for a mountain is as full of dwarves as bees in a hive, said Karl, who was getting in a temper. And do you think they would reward you handsomely for your services? Said Nora sarcastically. And oh, the poor little men, they always treated me with the utmost kindness and politeness, and gave me far more money than ever I bargained for. They nearly pinched me black and blue till I frightened them with my revolver, said Karl. For wretches, said Nora. But why? Because I was silly enough to tell them about the airship, and they thought I was humbugging them. How absurd, Nora exclaimed. What were we to do now, Karl? She continued in a doleful voice. I must have some money. We are still in debt for a greater part of our furniture, and the house is heavily mortgaged. If I could only get a good post, said Carl, sighing deeply. I had reckoned on those dwarf chaps. We shall never be able to marry, said Nora, now in the depths of despair. Our house will have to be given up, and our things sold by auction. And I shall have to marry a horrid, rich old peasant who will treat me as a servant, and father will be obliged to work in the fields. With this she burst into tears. It was quite dark now, save for the new moon whose pale crescent shone in the sky. Nora observed it in spite of her tears. The new moon, she exclaimed. Oh, do let us turn all the money that we've got in our pockets. How much have you got, Carl? About 10 shillings, he replied. Oh, you're richer than I am. I have only 8d in my purse. Nevertheless, let us turn what we have. It will be sure to bring us a fortune. Carl laughed. You little fairy, he said, and looked at her with admiration. Then involuntarily, his eyes strayed in the direction of a fir grove. He thought he could see something moving there. Nora looked too. Carl, she said excitedly, I do believe it was a dwarf man after all. Who else could it be? At the same moment, they caught sight of a queer form with a turned-up nose and peaked cap, clearly outlined against the sky, and recognized Mr. Query. Hello, said Carl. Hello to you, he said in a droll manner. Now, Mr. Dwarf, said Carl, anxious to proceed to business. What about our little agreement as to electric light, etc.? The committee has decided against it, said Mr. Query emphatically. What do we want of your newfangled inventions? You would bring your workmen with you. They would discover our treasures and turn the whole place into a mine. And of course, we should be obliged to decamp. Well, there is something in what you say, said Carl, to whom this idea had already occurred. But we could avoid that catastrophe. As for you, continued the dwarf, turning to Nora, we have discovered that you are a human being also, and no fairy. Therefore, we shall not require your services any longer. What a horrid way to give me notice, as if I could help not being a fairy, said poor Nora, weeping bitterly. The little fellow was much distressed. He could not make out what was the matter with her. Don't cry, little Fräuleinchen, he said. I am sure we never thought you were so fond of us, all that. It is very gratifying, but it is too late now to alter our decision. The way down to our kingdom is sealed forever. I could soon open it again, said Carl wrathfully. As for that, it would not be quite such an easy matter as you think, said Mr. Query mockingly. However, we are willing to offer you terms, he continued, if you will leave us alone and protect our secrets. What terms? Said Carl and Nora eagerly. You shall see, said the dwarf. Follow me to the fir trees. So saying, he sprang down from the stone on which he had been sitting, and came up and shook hands with them. We are going to be married. What do you think of that? We informed him. Humph, your taste, not mine, said Mr. Query. However, Nora will be able to clean your gold and silver dishes capitally. That's a comfort for you. We haven't got any gold and silver dishes to clean, alas, said Nora. Poor things, said Mr. Query. Well, we'll see. He proceeded to the fir trees where the gentlemen of the committee were again assembled, standing in a solemn semicircle. If you will sign this contract, we are willing to give you a reward. I speak in the name of the gentlemen of the committee, said Mr. Query, and the little men nodded their hands in assent. He drew out a roll of parchment from a bag he carried with him, and handed it to Carl. Nora looked over his shoulder. On the parchment was written the following. We, Carl Hammerstein, Nora O'Brien, pledge our solemn oath, Christmas tree, that we will not attempt to visit Dwarfland again, or molest the dwarfs in any way by offering them modern inventions which they have no use, etc., etc., or by revealing their secret chambers to the glaring light of day. Signed. We are willing enough to sign, said Carl. But what are your terms, old man? We want to know that first. You offered us a bribe, you know. All in good time, said Mr. Query. Gentlemen of the committee, display the treasure. The dwarf men formed themselves into a ring, in the center of which Nora and Carl could see masses of what looked like solid gold. "You may take as much of this as you like," they said, "and we warrant you on our solemn word of honor Christmas tree that it is pure, unalloyed gold." "We'll sign anything you like, dear little man," said Nora joyfully, "and invite you all to my wedding." 3 weeks from today," said Carl. But Nora was too excited to notice what he was saying. "I shall always believe in the new moon," she repeated again and again. "How shall we carry it?" she exclaimed suddenly. "I have not even got a basket with me." "My men shall trundle along for you in wheelbarrows," said Mr. Query. "No, please, do not say thank you. I have a great objection to being thanked." Carl and Nora now signed the document with joyful hearts. Nora professed herself very sorry not to see her dwarf friends again. She had a real affection for the droll little men. "You may come across us sometime again, who knows," said Mr. Query. "We make excursions into your world from time to time. It is improbable, but not impossible, that we may meet again. Goodbye." A brilliant flash as of lightning shot from under the ground. The earth trembled and shook. Nora clung to Carl in terror, for she thought that the earth would swallow them up too. Then Mr. Query and the dwarves disappeared underground, calling out as they did so, "You see, we have our lift and our electric light too, Mr. Engineer. Ha. We are not quite so behind the times as you thought us. Ha." Nora and Carl stood still in speechless astonishment. Then they looked anxiously for their gold, fearing that the dwarves might have played them a trick after all. But no, there were two jolly, strong-looking fellows with wheelbarrows. "We've got the gold all right," they said. "Don't you be afraid. We've put some dirty old potatoes at the top," they continued with a cunning expression on their faces. "Just in case we meet anyone on the way, you know. We should have to hop, skip, and jump. 1, 2, 3, and off. It might look awkward for you." "I'm sure it's very kind of you," said Nora, "and we can never thank you enough." And off they all set down the mountain. It was a troublesome job to get the heavy wheelbarrow over the stream. Nora declared afterwards that some of the gold was lost there, but they found no trace of it again if it were so. They did not feel safe until they reached the gate of Hotel Fancy. "Shall we put it in the backyard or in the stable?" said the little fellows in a hoarse whisper. "Put it in the corner of the stable," said Nora. "As we have not got a horse, no one goes in there. We will manage the rest. Thank you so much." "Please don't thank us," said the little man. "Dwarves are not used to that, and it hurts their feelings." "Well, here is something for your labors," said Carl, and he gave the little men a handful of silver. They turned it over and over and seemed to regard it as a great curiosity. Then they heard a movement in the house, and quick as lightning, they were off before Carl and Nora could say goodbye. Mr. O'Brien was pacing up and down in a great state of agitation. It was nearly midnight, and he feared they might have met with an accident. "There's no depending on the fairies," he said to himself, "and dwarves are said to be treacherous." So you see, he knew something of what Nora was up to. His joy was greater when Nora and Carl rushed in and dragged him to the stables, showing him a pile of gold. "I'll be for taking it to the bank at once," he said. "You never know but what it may melt away or turn to a heap of leaves. I've read stories like that." "Our wedding shall be next week," said Carl joyfully. "And aren't you going to give me any time to get my trousseau?" said Nora with a dancing light in her eyes that made her look even more enchanting than ever. "Sure. I'll be wanting the finest trousseau that ever a princess had." "We'll turn the Hotel Fancy into a palace," said Mr. O'Brien. The wedding was celebrated 3 weeks from this date, as we had agreed. Nora wore an exquisitely soft cream silk gown, embroidered with real gold. It was said that the embroidery was a present from the dwarves. Certain it is too that she wore an old pearl necklace of such marvelous workmanship, that the like of which was never seen before. The tale was whispered that a little deformed man had been seen to slip a parcel containing the necklace into the letterbox. Nora's relations came over from Ireland to be present at the wedding, and you may be sure that Carl's mother arrived too, all the way from Pomerania, to share the festivities and the cake. Hotel Fancy was crammed with guests. Every available room was occupied. There was some talk already of enlarging the house. One of the presents the bride had from her husband was a looking-glass set with a precious stone. People thought it was a curious wedding present and wondered if Nora was exceptionally vain, but Carl declared that if it had not been for a looking-glass, he might never have known his wife, a remark which sounded more mysterious than ever. Many conjectures were made concerning it, but none of them were half so strange as the truth. Another present was a brooch set in diamonds in the shape of a crescent moon. As they were now wealthy, Carl was able to indulge his passion for mechanical inventions, and Hotel Fancy was full of the most delightful surprises. Fountains in unexpected places, in the spray of which little balls danced up and down. A rare gramophone that played the most pleasant and soft music. Every variety of electrical light, and so on. Nora was a little disappointed that her friends the Doors did not come to the wedding. But what could she expect if her mother-in-law and uncles and aunts and cousins were all asked as well? Could she expect that the dignified Mr. Query would condescend to becoming an object of her general curiosity? I've heard that the little men called and left her cards some days after her wedding, when Nora and Carl were away on their honeymoon, and that Mr. O'Brien treated them as royal visitors, and they left charmed of his hospitality and astounded at the many entertaining and marvelous things to be seen in Hotel Fancy. The end.